I need a husband, and you need a strong daughter." The words hit him harder than the hail that had destroyed his last decent crop. The dust hadn't even settled from the morning rain when she appeared at his broken-down gate like thunder wrapped in calico. 7 feet of woman with shoulders that could carry the weight of winter, and eyes that had seen too much heartbreak to believe in fairy tales anymore. Eli Harper was knee-deep in mud, trying to patch a fence that should have been replaced 3 seasons ago, when her voice cut through the prairie wind like a blade through silk. He straightened slowly, mud sliding off his worn boots, and stared at the woman who just turned his world sideways with 9 simple words. She stood there like a monument to everything fierce and unbreakable, her dark hair whipping in the wind, her presence filling up the empty spaces of his failing ranch. This is the story of how a desperate proposal between 2 broken souls became something the frontier had never seen before, a love built not on romance, but on raw necessity. A marriage forged not in church pews, but in the harsh reality of survival. And a daughter who would grow up to be exactly what this unforgiving land demanded: fearless. But to understand how we got here, how a towering widow named Maeve Callahan came to be standing in Eli Harper's muddy yard with a marriage contract in her coat pocket, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when both of them still believed that hope was something worth holding on to. 2 months before that life-changing encounter, Eli Harper was a different man entirely. He had cattle that actually belonged to him, a brother who shared the workload, and dreams that hadn't yet been crushed under the weight of reality. The Harper Ranch stretched across 500 acres of decent grazing land, and Eli woke up every morning believing that hard work and honest dealing would eventually pay off. He was wrong about that. Dead wrong. The trouble started with a banker named Morrison, who wore suits that cost more than most men made in a year and smiled like a snake oil salesman at a church social. Morrison had been circling the Harper Ranch for months, making offers that sounded generous but felt like traps. When the winter came early and stayed late, when the cattle started dying and the feed ran out, Morrison's offers started looking less like opportunities and more like lifelines. That's when Eli's brother Marcus made the decision that would destroy everything they'd built together. Without telling Eli, without even a conversation, Marcus signed papers that put the ranch up as collateral for a loan they both knew they couldn't repay. The money was supposed to last them through the winter and into spring. Instead, it vanished into Marcus's gambling debts and whiskey habits faster than snow in July. By the time Eli found out what had happened, the bank had already started foreclosure proceedings. The ranch, the cattle, everything their father had spent his life building would be sold at auction within the month. Marcus disappeared the same night Eli confronted him, taking the last of their cash and leaving nothing behind but a note that said he was sorry, and a brother who suddenly understood what it meant to have absolutely nothing left to lose. That's how a man who once owned 500 acres of prime Montana territory ended up squatting in an abandoned barn, trying to fix tools with his bare hands and wondering if it was worth the effort to keep breathing. Meanwhile, 30 miles to the west, Maeve Callahan was dealing with her own version of impossible circumstances. At 7 feet tall in a world built for smaller people, she'd spent her entire life being stared at, whispered about, and treated like some kind of curiosity instead of a human being. Her first husband, Thomas Callahan, had been one of the few men brave enough to see past her unusual height to the woman underneath. Thomas had been good to her. He'd built their cabin with extra-high doorways and ceilings, bought furniture that could accommodate her long limbs, and never once made her feel like she needed to apologize for taking up space in the world. For 7 years, they'd been happy in the way that people who understand each other can be happy. Not passionate, not dramatic, just steady and real and good. But happiness has a way of making you forget how fragile life really is. Thomas died on a Tuesday morning in late September, thrown from his horse when it spooked at a rattlesnake. One moment he was waving goodbye as he rode out to check the north pasture, and the next moment Maeve was a widow with 800 acres of land, a cabin built for two, and a silence so complete it felt like drowning. The vultures started circling before Thomas was even cold in the ground. His cousin Jared showed up at the funeral with papers already drawn up, explaining how a woman like her couldn't possibly manage all that land on her own. Other men came calling with offers to help, but their eyes lingered on her property lines instead of her face, and their smiles never quite reached their eyes. Maeve Callahan had survived 34 years of being different in a world that punished difference. She wasn't about to let a bunch of small-minded men take away the only home she'd ever known just because they thought a woman couldn't hold on to what was hers. But she also wasn't naive enough to think she could fight them all off forever. She needed help. She needed protection. She needed a husband, not for love. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. What she needed was a partner who would work the land, defend what was theirs, and maybe, if they were both lucky, help her raise a daughter strong enough to inherit everything they built together. That's what brought her to Eli Harper's broken-down gate on that dusty morning in early spring. She'd heard about his situation from the widow who ran the general store in town. Heard about how he'd lost everything but still showed up every morning to work on that falling-down barn like tomorrow might actually come. Heard about how he'd helped old Mrs. Peterson fix her roof without asking for payment, and how he'd never once raised his voice to his brother, even after finding out about the betrayal. Most importantly, she'd heard that Eli Harper was honest. In a territory full of men who would sell their own mothers for the right price, honest was rarer than gold, and twice as valuable. So she'd saddled her biggest horse, put on her husband's old coat, and ridden across 30 miles of rough country to make the most unconventional proposal in the history of Montana Territory. She didn't bring flowers or pretty words or promises of romantic love. She brought a contract, a business proposition, and the kind of practical honesty that frontier life demanded. Standing there in his muddy yard, watching Eli Harper try to process what she just offered him, Maeve felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Hope. Not the soft, fragile kind of hope that breaks at the first sign of trouble, but the hard, practical kind that builds homes and raises children and survives whatever the world throws at it. She pulled the folded contract from her coat pocket and set it on a nearby hay bale, weighing it down with a rock so the wind wouldn't carry it away. The paper contained everything they both needed to know: property rights, work expectations, and the understanding that this arrangement was about survival, not sentiment. "Sun sets in 4 hours," she told him, her voice carrying across the empty yard like a challenge. "That's how long you have to decide." Then she turned and walked away, leaving muddy boot prints in his yard, and a man with nothing left to lose, staring at a piece of paper that might just save them both. The 4 hours stretched like a lifetime. Eli Harper stood in that muddy yard long after Maeve Callahan disappeared over the ridge, staring at that contract like it might bite him if he got too close. The wind kept trying to tear it loose from under the rock, and more than once he almost let it fly away. Would have been easier that way. Easier to pretend this whole thing never happened. But easy wasn't something Eli Harper could afford anymore. He picked up the paper with hands that shook worse than autumn leaves. The writing was neat, precise, businesslike. No flowery language about love and devotion. Just cold, hard facts laid out like fence posts. She would provide land, shelter, and resources. He would provide labor, protection, and his name. Together they would work toward building something that could last, something that could survive the kind of hardships that had already destroyed everything else he'd ever cared about. At the bottom of the contract, in the same careful handwriting, were the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And maybe one day, a girl child strong enough to outlive both of us. A daughter. Eli had never thought much about children before. His life had been cattle and horses and the endless work of keeping a ranch running. But standing there in the ruins of everything he'd once believed in, the idea of raising a little girl who might grow up to be as fierce and unbreakable as Maeve Callahan herself seemed like the only thing in the world worth fighting for. The sun was hanging low in the western sky when Eli finally made his decision. He walked to his father's old tool shed, the one building the bank hadn't been able to take because it sat just outside the official property line, and pulled out a battered ink pen and a bottle of black ink that had probably been there since before he was born. His signature looked shaky and uncertain on that contract, but it was there. Eli Harper, written in letters that would bind him to a woman he barely knew and a future he couldn't imagine. As the last light faded from the sky, he saddled the one-horse Marcus hadn't managed to lose in his gambling sprees and rode west toward the Callahan Ranch. The night was cold and clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds spilled on black velvet. Every mile that passed under his horse's hooves felt like a step away from the man he used to be and toward something entirely unknown. The Callahan Ranch materialized out of the darkness like something from a dream. The main house was bigger than Eli had expected, built from local stone with a roof that looked like it could withstand anything nature might throw at it. Light spilled from the windows in warm, golden squares, and smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line toward the stars. Maeve was waiting on the porch, arms folded across her chest, as still and solid as the mountains themselves. She'd changed out of her traveling clothes into a simple dress that somehow made her seem even taller and more imposing. When she saw him riding up the path, she didn't wave or call out. She just watched, patient as stone, while he dismounted and walked toward her with a signed contract in his hand. "I signed it," Eli said, holding out the paper. Maeve didn't take it right away. Instead, she looked him over from head to toe, her eyes taking in everything about him like she was memorizing details for future reference. Her gaze lingered on his worn boots, his patched coat, the way his shoulders curved inward like a man who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. "You still want to die?" she asked, her voice cutting through the night air like a blade. The question hit him like a physical blow. Eli opened his mouth to deny it, to protest that he'd never wanted any such thing, but the words died in his throat. Because the truth was, he had wanted to die. For weeks after losing the ranch, after his brother's betrayal, he'd woken up every morning wishing he hadn't. He'd gone through the motions of living without actually caring whether he saw another sunrise. "Because I'm not marrying a man who's halfway out of the world," Maeve continued. "I need someone who will stay, someone who will fight when she cries at midnight and asks why her hands aren't small like other girls." Eli swallowed hard, tasting dust and defeat, and something else he couldn't quite name. "I'm not leaving," he said, and for the first time in months, he meant it. Maeve nodded once, a sharp movement that seemed to settle something between them. She took the contract from his hands, glanced at his signature, then folded it and tucked it into her apron pocket. "Come inside," she said. "We've got planning to do." The interior of the house was even more impressive than the outside. The ceilings were high enough to accommodate Maeve's unusual height, and everything was built on a scale that made normal-sized people feel small. The furniture was solid and well-made, the kind that would last for generations. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace big enough to roast a whole pig, and the smell of fresh bread hung in the air like a promise. Maeve led him to a kitchen table that could have seated a dozen people comfortably. She poured coffee from a pot that had been keeping warm on the stove and set a plate of cornbread in front of him without asking if he was hungry. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and the cornbread was still warm from the oven. "We'll marry tomorrow," she said, settling into a chair across from him. "Pastor Williams owes me 3 favors, and I'm calling one in." Eli nearly choked on his coffee. "Tomorrow? No point in waiting. The longer we delay, the more time people have to cause trouble. Jared's already been sniffing around, asking questions about my business. Once we're legally married, he'll have to back off." She was right, of course. In a territory where a woman's property rights were about as solid as morning mist, marriage was the only real protection Maeve had. But the speed of it all made Eli's head spin. 24 hours ago, he'd been a broken-down cowboy with nothing but lint in his pockets. Now he was about to become the husband of the most formidable woman in 3 counties. "What do you expect from me?" he asked. Maeve's expression didn't change. Work, loyalty, children, if we're blessed with them. I don't expect love, if that's what you're asking. Love is something that grows between people over time, or it doesn't. What I need is partnership. The honesty of it was both brutal and refreshing. No pretty lies about destiny or romantic nonsense about love at first sight. Just two people agreeing to face whatever came next together, for better or worse. They talked until well past midnight, working out the practical details of their arrangement. Eli would move into the main house, but they would start with separate bedrooms. He would take over the heavy labor around the ranch, while Maeve continued to handle the business side of things. They would present a united front to the outside world, no matter what private disagreements they might have. And someday, if they were lucky and careful and strong enough to survive what the frontier threw at them, they would raise a daughter who would inherit everything they built together. When Eli finally rode back to his broken-down barn in the early hours of the morning, the world felt different somehow. The same stars were overhead. The same wind was blowing across the prairie, but everything had changed. He was no longer a man with nothing to lose. He was a man with everything to gain. The wedding took place the next afternoon under a sky so blue it looked painted on. Pastor Williams arrived with his Bible and his questions, both of which Maeve answered with the kind of directness that made grown men step backward. She wore her best black dress, the one she'd saved for special occasions, with boots that had seen more honest work than most men's hands ever would. Eli cleaned up as best he could with what little he had. His shirt was patched but pressed, his hair combed back with water from the well. He looked like a man trying to rise above his circumstances, and maybe that was enough. The ceremony lasted exactly 7 minutes. No flowers, no music, no guests, except for the wind and a hawk circling overhead. When Pastor Williams asked if she took this man, Maeve interrupted before he could finish the question. I do. Let's get on with it. The ring was a simple band of silver that had belonged to Eli's mother, the only thing of value he had left in the world. When he slipped it onto Maeve's finger, her hand was steady as granite. When she placed her grandfather's gold band on his finger, Eli felt the weight of it like a promise he wasn't sure he knew how to keep. You may kiss the bride, Pastor Williams said, but Maeve was already turning away. That'll do, she said. And somehow those 2 words carried more meaning than all the pretty speeches Eli had ever heard at other weddings. That night, for the first time in months, Eli slept under a real roof on a real bed instead of on the ground wrapped in a horse blanket. Maeve had prepared the guest room for him, complete with clean sheets and a wash basin. The bed was too soft after so many nights on hard ground, but he didn't complain. Complaining was a luxury he couldn't afford. Through the thin walls, he could hear Maeve moving around in her own room, getting ready for sleep. The sounds were oddly comforting. For so long, the only nighttime sounds he'd heard were his own breathing and the distant howling of coyotes. Now there was another human being just a few feet away, someone who had chosen to share her life with his, even if that choice was based on necessity rather than affection. The work began before sunrise. Maeve woke him with a cup of coffee so strong it could have stripped paint and a list of chores that would have overwhelmed 3 normal men. But Eli Harper wasn't normal anymore. He was a man with something to prove and nowhere else to go, which made him dangerous in the way that desperate people always are. He fixed the north gate that had been hanging crooked for 2 years. He cleared the irrigation ditch that fed water to the south pasture. He repaired the chicken coop and replaced half the shingles on the barn roof. Every nail he hammered, every board he sawed, every fence post he set was a declaration that he belonged here, that he had earned his place in this strange new life. Maeve worked alongside him without comment or complaint. She could swing an axe better than most lumberjacks and stack firewood faster than he could split it. When the dinner bell rang at sunset, they would sit across from each other at that massive kitchen table, too tired to talk but comfortable in their shared exhaustion. Weeks passed like this. Work and meals and sleep and more work. They developed a rhythm that felt almost natural, like two oxen learning to pull the same plow. Eli began to understand the ranch in ways he never had when it was just something he was trying to survive. This was something he was helping to build, something that might actually last. The first real test came on a Tuesday evening in late spring. Jared Holt arrived in a cloud of dust and arrogance, riding a horse that cost more than most people made in a year. He was Thomas Callahan's cousin, a man who had always believed that Maeve's unusual height was some kind of cosmic joke, and that her inheritance was wasted on someone like her. Jared dismounted with the casual confidence of a man who had never been told no and expected to continue that streak indefinitely. He looked around the ranch yard with the appraising eye of someone calculating property values, then fixed his attention on Eli with the kind of smile that made decent people check their wallets. "So, you're the new husband," Jared said, making the words sound like something he'd scraped off his boot. "Heard you got yourself quite a bargain. All this land, all these assets, and all you had to do was marry the giant." Eli set down the hammer he'd been using to repair the front steps. The tool felt good in his hands, solid and purposeful. He didn't speak, just stood there waiting to see what kind of man Jared Holt really was underneath all that expensive clothing and practiced charm. "Course, I'm wondering how long it'll last," Jared continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a confidence. "Marriage contracts can be broken, especially when one party isn't holding up their end of the bargain. And I'm thinking a woman like Maeve needs a real man, not some broken-down cowboy playing house." That's when Maeve stepped out onto the porch, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator, every step deliberate and dangerous. The rifle in her hands wasn't pointed at Jared, but it wasn't pointing away from him either. "You've got 30 seconds to state your business and ride off," she said, her voice carrying across the yard like thunder rolling in from distant mountains. Jared's confidence flickered for just a moment, but he recovered quickly. Men like him always did. They'd spent their whole lives believing that charm and money could buy them out of any situation, and old habits died hard. "Now, Maeve, there's no need for hostility. I'm just looking out for family interests. Thomas wouldn't have wanted his land going to some stranger who doesn't understand its value." "Thomas left this land to me," Maeve replied. "Not to you, not to his family, to me. And what I do with it is none of your concern." Eli watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't really about him or about marriage contracts. This was about power and control, and the age-old belief that women couldn't be trusted to make their own decisions. Jared wasn't here to cause trouble for a failed cowboy. He was here to take what he believed should have been his all along. "You can't work all this land by yourself," Jared said, his tone becoming more reasonable, more persuasive. "It's too much for any one person, even someone as capable as you. Sell it to me, and I'll give you enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. You could move to town, maybe find yourself a more suitable husband." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Jared had just called Eli unsuitable to his face, questioned Maeve's judgment, and suggested that she couldn't handle her own property. 3 strikes in as many sentences. Eli stepped forward, not quickly, not aggressively, just moving with the steady purpose of a man who had finally figured out where he stood. He didn't say anything threatening or dramatic. He just positioned himself between Jared and the porch, close enough that the other man had to look up to meet his eyes. "Mister," Eli said quietly, "I think you should leave now." Jared laughed, but there was something forced about it, something that suggested he wasn't quite as confident as he wanted to appear. "Or what? You'll throw me off the property? You and what army?" Eli didn't answer. He just stood there, patient as stone, while Jared tried to stare him down. It was a contest the smaller man was never going to win. Eli had spent too many years being beaten down by circumstances beyond his control to be intimidated by one arrogant rancher with more money than sense. After what felt like an eternity, Jared's smile faltered. He looked from Eli to Maeve and back again, finally understanding that he wasn't going to get what he came for through intimidation or charm. "This isn't over," he said, mounting his expensive horse with less grace than he'd dismounted. "Marriage or no marriage, a woman can't hold on to this much land forever. Sooner or later you're going to need help, and when you do, don't come crying to me." He rode away in another cloud of dust, but the threat lingered in the air like the smell of sulfur after lightning strikes. Eli watched until horse and rider disappeared over the ridge, then turned to find Maeve studying him with those sharp, calculating eyes. "You meant what you said," she observed. "I don't say things I don't mean." Something shifted in her expression, some internal wall coming down just a fraction. She nodded once, that same sharp movement he was beginning to recognize as her version of approval, then turned and walked back into the house. That night, she didn't just prepare the guest room for him. She opened the door to her own bedroom and stood there waiting, not saying anything, not making promises or declarations, just offering him a choice. Eli made his decision the same way he'd made all the important decisions in his life lately. Not because it was easy or comfortable or what he'd planned, but because it felt right in a way that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the kind of trust that had to be earned one day at a time. 6 months later, Maeve missed her morning chores for the first time since Eli had known her. He found her sitting on the edge of the bed, pale and shaking, one hand pressed against her stomach. "What's wrong?" he asked, already reaching for her wrist to check her pulse the way his mother had taught him when he was barely old enough to reach the kitchen table. Maeve didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "I think I'm pregnant." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. He stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what she'd just told him. A baby. Their baby. The daughter they'd written about in that practical marriage contract was no longer just a theoretical possibility. He knelt beside the bed and took her hand in both of his. Her fingers were cold but steady, just like everything else about her. "I told you I wouldn't leave," he said, pressing his lips against her knuckles. That hasn't changed. For the first time since he'd known her, Maeve Callahan's eyes filled with tears. She didn't let them fall. That wasn't her way. But they were there, bright and real and impossible to ignore. "Guess we're getting that daughter," Eli whispered. The baby came early, in the middle of a winter storm that howled around the house like all the demons in hell were trying to get inside. Maeve labored for 18 hours while the wind shook the windows and snow piled up against the doors. There was no doctor, no midwife, just Eli and his shaking hands and prayers to a God he wasn't sure was listening. At 3:14 in the morning, their daughter entered the world red-faced and furious, screaming her displeasure at the cold and the noise and the general unfairness of being born during a blizzard. Maeve held her against her chest and wept openly for the first time since Thomas died, whispering words of welcome and promise into the baby's dark hair. They named her June, after the month when everything grows wild and free and unstoppable. And right there in the lamplight with the storm raging outside, Eli made a vow that would shape the rest of their lives. "I swear I'll teach her how to swing back," he said. Maeve looked up at him, exhausted and blood-streaked, but more beautiful than he'd ever seen her. "And I'll teach her never to apologize for being strong." 20 years later, when June Callahan Harper rode away from the ranch to make her own mark on the world, she carried with her everything her parents had given her. The strength to stand tall in a world built for smaller people. The courage to fight for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against her. The wisdom to know that sometimes the best partnerships are built on necessity and trust rather than romance and pretty words. And somewhere in the wind that followed her down the dusty road, the voices of her parents whispered the lesson they'd spent her whole life teaching her. That fearless doesn't mean unafraid. It means afraid but willing to act anyway. The ranch still stands today, though the original buildings have been replaced and expanded over the generations. The gate still bears the name Callahan Harper, carved deep into weathered wood that has survived decades of prairie storms and mountain winters. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right across those endless grasslands, you can still hear the echo of a giant woman's voice declaring to the world that love isn't always about flowers and pretty promises. Sometimes it's about finding someone willing to stand beside you when the whole world tries to knock you down. Sometimes it's about building something strong enough to last long after you're gone. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's about raising a daughter fearless enough to carry that strength into whatever future awaits. That's the kind of love that changes the world, one generation at a time.